Hi, I'm Jared Fuller. Welcome to Scratching the Surface. The day I'm recording this intro is the closing day of the 2025 Venice Architecture Biennale. When you listen to this in a few days, it'll have just closed after opening back in May. This year's Biennale was curated by architect, engineer, author, and educator Carlo Ratti and was called Intelligence, Natural, Artificial, Collective. Featuring over 300 contributions from more than 750 participants who come not just from architecture, but also engineers, mathematicians, climate scientists, philosophers, and more. This year's exhibition looked at how architecture needs to draw on multiple intelligences to adapt to the climate crisis. As Carlo writes, in times of adaptation, architecture needs to reach out across generations and across disciplines, from the hard sciences to the arts. In times of adaptation, architecture must rethink authorship and become more inclusive. Architecture must become flexible and dynamic as the world we are now designing for. Carlo said he wanted the biennial to be a lab. He wanted it to start conversations, and conversations were certainly started. So instead of having Carlo on the show at the opening, I thought it might be interesting to speak with him now, at the end of the exhibition, so we could talk about the conversations he wanted to start, the reception to the exhibitions, and how the presentation fits into his larger body of work and research. Like I said, Carlo is an architect, but he's also an engineer, an author, and an academic. He's the founder of Carlo Ratti Associates, an architecture and innovation office, and he runs the Sensible City Lab at MIT. He's the author of multiple books, including The City of Tomorrow, Atlas of Sensible City, and Open Source Architecture. Always traveling. I talked to Carlo when he was in Rio de Janeiro earlier this month, about a month before the Biennale closed, to talk through all of this. We talk about what he means when he talks about intelligences, why he initiated an open call for participants this year, the receptions and the critique of the Biennale, and how architecture fits into larger conversations about the climate crisis. We also talk about his work with the Sensible City Lab that he runs at MIT and how architects and designers can situate themselves between technology and humans, how climate should force architects to reconsider their roles, and why he still considers himself an optimist, just not a techno-optimist. If you like this show and what we do here, you can support our work by joining our Substack. We have a monthly newsletter that is free for all, as well as a paid tier that gets you a bonus interview every month and helps keep this show free for everyone. I hope this show is like listening to a great conversation in a coffee shop. And so for the price of a cup of coffee a month, you can help us do this work and be a part of these conversations. Carlo Ratti, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much for having me.
So we're talking right as the Venice Biennial is about to close. The theme this year was intelligence, natural, artificial, and collective. And I thought we could start by just walking through those for a second. What is intelligence? And how do you think about what natural, artificial, and collective intelligences are?
Sure. Well, thank you. Thank you for asking it. Well, it hasn't closed yet. There's still almost a month. The Venice Biennale closes on the 23rd of November this year. But, at the very beginning, I was thinking about calling this NI instead of AI, NI, so natural intelligence. And that's, I think we are too focused on this idea of AI. It's everywhere. Every time we open a newspaper article and so on, it's about AI. And also people think, is AI is ChatGPT. It's not, but
Right.
so I thought it was important to look at the incredible intelligence that we have in the more generally in nature and how it has shaped the built environment for thousands of years. So initially the idea was almost to be perhaps a bit more provocative and call it NI, but then I thought, well, in the face of the climate crisis, in the face of adapting to a changing climate and a changing planet, we should actually be inclusive and include different types of intelligence. So that's how the title came up. It's intelligence. We spell it actually with the Latin root, intelligent. And we like it for two reasons. One is that actually you got only one word. Usually the title for the Venice Biennale is both in Italian and in English. In this case, we only use one for both. And but the other thing is that in the Latin root, you got this idea of multiplicity. Is intelligence contain gens, and gens is about plurality, it's about different type of intelligence. So that's how the idea came up: intelligence, natural, artificial, collective, and looking at how we can leverage everything we have in order to tackle again changing climate and the changing planet.
I want to come back to the climate piece for a second, but I want to dig a little deeper on what you just said about this idea of multiplicity. I think one of the kind of innovations of this year's biennial, or one of the things that I saw talked about a lot when people wrote about it, was the fact that there were 750 participants, and they were not just architects. You had engineers, mathematicians, climate scientists, philosophers, artists, chefs, coders, writers, wood carvers, farmers, fashion designers. I've heard you talk in other places about the exhibition that architecture is a field or a discipline that can bring different types of intelligences together. How do you think architecture does that, or how can architecture be a node of dialogue between these different intelligences?
Yeah, no, thank you for asking this. And architecture has been exploring and trying to venture into other disciplines for a long time. Architecture, many biennales in the past, architecture has been going more, venturing into art, into politics, into other disciplines. In this case, actually, today we're saying architecture is about the built environment. So the definition of architecture is about the built environment. It is what the great Abbé Lauget in 18th century France would say is about adapting, mediating between the climate outside and the need of comfort that we need. This was the idea of primitive hut that was developed by the Abbé Lauget in the 18th century. And so that is the perimeter. But here we're saying it's a bit different. It's not architecture venturing into other territory. It's actually many disciplines help in architecture. If you look at this and if you look at some of the challenges we face, first of all, we don't need to build much more. In most countries, population is not growing. I think, we don't need to build anything. If you think about North America, South America, Europe, most of Asia, population and fertility rates are under replacement rates. So it's not about building more, it's about adapting what you already have. And then for adaptation, then we need, to bring on the turf, on the built environment, to bring many disciplines. And the ones you mentioned before is, again, different type of intelligence, different disciplines, again, in order to experiment. That's going back to the very origin of architecture, as we were saying, this kind of idea of the primitive hut by Lauget.
I think that's like such a subtle difference between architecture venturing into these other disciplines and architecture being in dialogue with these other disciplines or being in conversation. What does that actually look like in the Biennale? How did that help structure the exhibitions, knowing that this was not just architects, but architects and all these other intelligences? Did that change how you thought about the structuring or the curatorial process at all?
Yeah, it is interesting because when you're bringing all these different disciplines, then the first thing you need to change is also authorship. And it is true that in architecture, traditionally, you got the architect, sometimes the star architect, and everybody else is a consultant. And so one thing, for instance, we try to change this year in Venice is actually making sure everybody's credited exactly in the same way. That is what happens with academic papers.
Right.
You might define everybody's contribution, but you credit everybody in the paper. And so the first thing was about trying to change that mechanism. And so you got beautiful teams. I love it. You got teams with Pritzker Prize winners or Nobel Prize winners, together with architects just out of universities, students still in university, all working together again to innovate in the built environment. So the first thing is about authorship. The second thing we tried, to me, was a little bit of a surprise, the fact that, in so many years, the Venice Biennale is the oldest Biennale, starts at the end of the 19th century, but it never had an open call. It was always
Yeah.
this kind of top-down system where the director, what I did this year, basically picks and chooses, what he think is the best in the world of art one year, in the world of architecture the next year. And so for the first time, we had this kind of open call. I think the Biennale was a bit reluctant to call it fully an open call.
Yeah.
So we called it Space for Ideas. But for me, it was both magic and daunting. Well, daunting because we were flooded with proposals from all over the world, thousands and thousands, and you had to reply to thousands and thousands of emails. But at the same time, it was magic. It was magic because it allows us again to find voices that otherwise we would not have been able to listen to.
Where did that idea to do an open call to run this sort of platform Space for Ideas, where did that come from in your process? Like, how early were you interested in doing something like that, and how do you think that actually influenced the diversity of participants in the show? Did it radically change your conception of this idea of intelligence?
Yeah, I think this was from the very beginning. My first book now, over 10 years ago, was with Matthew Claudel, was open source architecture,
Right,
how
right.
architecture can learn from opening up from open source. And again, it's bottom up. It's, the bottom up. At the time, we called the role of the architect, we called it in the book the choral architect,
Mm.
somebody who's able to harmonize these different voices, not really to be the soloist. And so I think it was from the very beginning. Also, when we curated the Shenzhen Biennale in 2019, the Shenzhen Biennale is very different. It's still the largest Biennale in Asia, but the format is different than the Venice Biennale. But there as well, we had an open call. So from the very beginning, we thought we wanted to listen to all the possible voices. Again, there's no way a curator can know everything that's going on. Maybe
Right.
at a university on the other side of the planet, somebody just and so then you need that, and so we wanted to try.
I think that sort of radically changes the composition of what you see when you're on the ground. I want to go back to the climate crisis and how that relates to this idea of intelligence. You're often, when you're talking about intelligence, you're talking about the relationship between technology and nature in regards to the climate crisis, and you're talking about how we have to move from mitigation to adaptation. Walk me through that shift from mitigation to adaptation and how that actually is manifesting itself in this umbrella of intelligence.
Yes, of course. I will start really from the second part about mitigation to
Yeah.
adaptation. Architecture has been engaging with climate for a long time.
Hmm.
If you think it is a beautiful little book, I think it dates back from the 1990s by Richard Rogers, Cities for a Small Planet.
Oh,
It's all
yeah.
about
Yeah.
mitigation. Mitigation is about how we can reduce emissions, how we can reduce, the impact on the planet. And I still think that mitigation is very important. But let's face it, this is not about politics, it's about data. The data tells us that things are changing. Things have already changed. Paris is planning to face extreme summer temperatures of 50 degrees Celsius. Today, I'm in Rio de Janeiro, where we have a lab. And, last year here we had 65 degrees Celsius. 65 was the perceived temperature, around 40 to 50. It was the real temperature plus a lot of humidity. Now, under those extreme conditions, we need to adapt. And so adaptation was once seen as kind of as a failure in the past, but
Hmm.
we need to realize that now that the climate has changed and architecture also has to engage with adaptation. The good thing is that architecture knows how to do it. Again, if you go back to the Abbé Lauger, what we said before, in 18th century France, it was about adapting and mediating between a climate outside and the comfort, the necessity of comfort we have. So that's about this part. And then how to do it? Well, really by leveraging everything we can. And that's a different type of intelligence, a way to bring different disciplines together to adapt again to the changing planet and the changing climate.
I'm curious about this idea of adaptation as it relates to the human or the often centrality of the human in these conversations. And it strikes me that when you talk about it, I'm hearing a larger kind of ecological question here. In the catalog, there's the Circular Economy Manifesto, where the last point of that is to design for nature. And I'm wondering how you think about adaptation as it relates to how we design cities, how we design buildings, how we structure how we live together. That's not just good for people, but also good for a tree or a bird or what. Like, how do other species um, how do we relate to other species and the design for other species when we think about this idea of adaptation?
Yes, and you're absolutely spot on. I think first of all, maybe just mention about what you talked about, the circular manifesto.
Mhm.
It started because we've always engaged with temporary projects. Think about, and we always enjoyed working for expos. We've done it a number of times in Saragossa, in Milan, in Dubai. This year, we designed the French pavilion in Osaka, with the Olympics, with also Milan Design Week. Usually, when you're doing something temporary, you can push the boundary. And it's no
Mm.
surprise that if you look at the history of architecture in the 20th century, a lot of amazing things were developed in such conditions. Think about just one out of many, Miss van der Rohe Pavilion in Barcelona. Think
Mm.
about the Expo in '67 in Osaka. Now, at the same time, and the reason for that is that you can take more risk, you can experiment more. You're not building something that should stand for 50 or 500 years. You can actually do something temporary and again, push the boundaries of architecture. At the same time, there's a problem. And the problem is that you're doing something at expos, for instance, you're building almost like a temporary city, but unlike Burning Man, that is not going to be reused or burned down. It's sometimes it goes to landfill. So what we wanted to do this year is to use the Biennale as a way to experiment. And so what we did was to engage some of the key people working on circularity. First of all, Andrew MacArthur and First Foundation, they've been at the forefront for circularity. Arup is amazing engineers.
Yep. Yep.
This manifesto, we try to see how everything at the Biennale can be recycled or reused at the end. Now, we couldn't force everybody to follow the same principle. But most people embrace them. And let me give you one example. Is actually that the construction of the Venice Biennale was made without any plasterboard. And
Mm.
actually, most of the panels you see in Venice are old furniture that's been turned into new chipboard. And at the end of the Biennale, we'll have this kind of big machine that again turns them into new chipboard. So I like this idea that the Biennale will keep on living in the
Mm.
kitchens, in the bathroom of people all around the planet. So there's one example about
Yeah, I
the
love that.
and 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 that is for us was a way to kind of walk the talk in the Biennale itself.
I think this weirdly gets to one of the critiques that I saw of the Biennale. It's now been up since May. It's closing in about a month. Phineas Harper in Art Review called it a tech bros fever dream, and Ollie Wainwright in The Guardian said that it channels the techno optimists' harmonious union that technology and nature will save us. And what strikes me in your answer is that you're talking about architects being the connecting points between these different views, and I'm wondering how you think about how architects and designers respond to this kind of increasingly dominant techno solutionism, Silicon Valley, big data. How do those of us that work in design and architecture in the built world, how do we counter that? How do we respond to that? How do we stay in dialogue with that? How do you kind of think through that relationship?
Yeah, first of all, a couple of things to begin with. First of all, I think a Biennale should start a conversation. If you had a
Mm-hmm.
Biennale that everybody says is great or is terrible, I think what you need to
Right.
have is put something on the table that people can feel passionate about. And
Right.
so this is great. I laughed a lot. With some of the reviews that were one of my favorite has been. I'll tell you a little story. One of my favorite has been, just for the sake of the public, we wanted to make the Biennale very accessible. And every architect, like they usually do, they sent us the
Oh,
long
right.
text describing their project. And so we decided, okay, let's ask ChatGPT to turn it into a small summary so that somebody who wants to jump from one project to the other can just
Right. I
look at
saw
that. And then
this. Yeah.
if you want, you can go to the next level and read the full thing. And if you want to go, you can even go deeper and scan the QR code and get a full essay about the project. I mean, a lot of critics went berserk
Right.
because of that.
I saw this
And,
too.
and,
Yeah.
and I thought it was so funny because it was one way to be, and I think they probably felt threatened by
Mm.
AI. So, but going back to the point, I think, it is great that we had the conversation. It is great that people disagree, that people agree, and that we can discuss it. Actually, as a matter of fact, for the first time, we had during the Biennale something we call like a Gens festival. Every day, there's so far, I mean, tens of thousands of people in the Arsenale in a beautiful space curated initially by Chris Hawthorne. They're basically like we call it speaker's corner, where people can come up to 100 people, can have a conversation and discuss. So
Hmm.
anyway, the point is that it is great that there's discussion, that people can disagree. The only thing that sometimes left me kind of a little bit of a sour taste is when people were. There's very few examples, but not fully in good faith. I'll give you an example. The last section, we called it out. And at the
Mm.
beginning, we write very big. Out is about out of the earth. And you're going to look at architecture in space. And we write really, really big.
Hmm.
Something that says, this is not at all Elon Musk idea about colonizing Mars. This is about, satellites that can help us save our only home. There's also a beautiful text by Martin Rees, the astronomer royal, in the catalog.
Mm.
And he says the same thing. I couldn't be more distant than what Elon Musk says. And, the point is about, yes, space can help save our only home, and that's Earth. And some people either they didn't read it or somehow with a bit of prejudice, thought that we were arguing for going outside the planet. And that applies a little bit like this kind of techno bro. I told you before, my initial idea was to call it NI.
Right. Right.
The natural intelligence, the collective intelligence are the biggest sections of the Biennale. The artificial is not only about AI, it's not about Silicon Valley. I think it is about networks, it's about, sensors, it's about empowering people through the sharing of information. It is also about AI, but AI, for instance, is Rafik Anadol's project, looking at how to design better with nature. So anyway, what I want to say is that it's certainly not a technology Biennale. At the beginning was almost like the counterpoint. And then it's more like an inclusive, natural, artificial, collective to tackle some
Right.
of the big challenges we face. And I'm sure we'll make it. If we come together, we'll be able to solve them.
Well, and one of the reasons I wanted to ask you about those critiques is because for you, this is not just theoretical. You're actually trying to put these ideas into practice, both in your studio and at MIT in the Sensible City Lab. It seems like there's a synergy between that research. So I guess I have sort of a two-part question. First, tell me about the research purview of the Sensible City Lab, and how does that maybe connect to these ideas that you are exploring on a more theoretical level in the Biennale?
Yeah. Well, and I like your question also because it deals with a little bit like yes, I'm an optimist, but not about technology, but the fact that
Right.
architecture, um, the great Karl Popper said optimism is a duty. And why
Yeah.
is it a duty? Because it deals with the future. And the future, he says, it's not predetermined. It's not something to be predicted, but the future is something we all build together. So
Right.
you must be an optimist because we are engaged in building the future. And you know what? The way to build the future is the project, is
Mm-hmm.
design.
Mm-hmm.
Project comes from Latin projectus, and it's about looking beyond. It's about looking at the future, and you're thinking about how we can change our cities into something better. And yes, so we try to do it, and I think that this happens through trial and error. So I'm not saying that I think whatever we try to do, cities try to do, that architecture trying is really part of this evolutionary system. You try something and see what works, what doesn't. We try to do that both in research at MIT with Sensible City Lab, now with a number of labs in different cities around the planet, in Singapore, in Seoul, in Dubai, in Amsterdam, Milan, and in Rio. Those are kind of smaller labs where we actually
Hmm.
can have more feedback with cities. We try to do it with our design office, again, trying to engage with projects that deal with adaptation, but also in other ways. I think, you mentioned at the beginning, before we started the recording, writing. I think writing is a great
Right.
way to create a feedback loop, to throw an idea and then have a conversation. So I really believe in that. I think those are different ways by which we can try something and see what works and what doesn't.
How is the sensible city different from what we sometimes call the smart city? How do you see those overlapping? How do those start to diverge from each other?
Yeah, I always hated the word smart city, and the reason is that smart city gives the idea of the city almost like a computer in open air. And
Right,
I think
right.
that's why at the very beginning, with the Sensible City, we started it 20 years ago. But the idea of sensible was a city that's able to sense, but also sensible. And so the idea is to put people at the center. And yes, if you think about this, what is smart city? Well, smart city has what has happened if you look at the past 5 or 10 years. Think about how much the way of working, the way of living, the way of ordering food at home, deliveries,
Hmm.
meeting,
Hmm.
mating, and so on has changed. And that's because of networks and digital information. Anything, even very simple things like Uber, they didn't exist. They're part of this kind of thing. But for us, sensible means to do things that are related to this space of city and data with only one objective, that's improving the human side of things.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, that's in many ways that's the theme of your 2016 book, The City of Tomorrow. You write, our starting point is usually human experience. The important thing is not to start with the technology, it's how the technology can affect lives. If you start with the human experience, you can see traffic, you can see connections, et cetera, et cetera. And I think so much of in a weird way, this goes back to the kind of open source, open call of the Biennale, in that this is about a difference between top down or bottom up. Smart city is top down, corporate centered, sort of shareholder centered, technology centered. Sensible city, and the idea of the sensible city is, how do we use these things to recenter the human from the ground up? Does that sound right to you? Is that the right interpretation?
Yeah, I love the way you phrase it. And this goes back to the origin of city. We didn't have cities 10,000 years ago, and then humanity found this amazing way to be together. So that together we can exchange goods, exchange ideas, perhaps exchange chromosomes. So basically, together, be more than each of us individually. And if you look at this tension, one you're mentioning, top down and bottom up, has been there since the beginning.
Mm-hmm.
The uh, think about Athens and Sparta. They were the top down, the military city, and also bottom up, the democratic Athens. Now, the good news is, if you look at the past thousands of years, usually bottom up has always won. Top
Mm-hmm.
down seems more effective for a little while,
Right.
but then
Right.
that easily disintegrates with somebody who goes nuts, is an autocrat, with people making wrong decisions. So that's another reason, I think, to be optimistic.
Is this I you're making me think of something. This was not something I was planning to ask you, but as you're talking about this, is making me think about, again, the role of the architect or the role of the designer. And I think that that position approaches technology differently, in ideally, hopefully, in the best case scenario, is putting the human at the center, where the Silicon Valley, the tech bro, whatever you want to call it, is using technology in service of some sort of control or profit. How do you, both in your studio and in the lab, how do you approach technology? How do you make sure that you are keeping the human centered and you're not romancing the data, romancing the sensors, romancing, whatever the next thing is? How do you find that balance? How do you kind of think through that on a day-to-day basis?
Yeah, I would say in two ways. The first one is that, again, you start by asking questions that from people, and technology is just another tool. Sometimes
Mm,
you use it, sometimes you don't.
hmm
But the other thing is not to be deterministic.
mm,
We've seen a lot of terrible things happening by being implemented in the 20th century by well-meaning architects and planners. They simply thought they had the solution and they had to implement it at scale. We saw it in many new cities, new capitals in the 20th century, top down. And so I think the best way is also to do it with humility and say,
mm.
let's try and see how people respond. So again, you might have your convictions. You try to do something that you think will turn out well, but you need to be open to surprises. And the best way is again to open it up and let people decide. Citizens decide what type of city they want to live in.
How does that change, or how have you seen it change, or or maybe how has your own design process changed in thinking about this relationship between technology and human? How does this change, like, quote unquote, architecture, or what architecture is or can be, or the built environment, or the construction of cities, all this stuff that we're talking about? How do these questions that you're asking change how we build, or what we build, or how we think about what a city can be?
I think one important component, I think, people have always seen this kind of fracture between what we could call architecture without architects.
Right,
Think about a
right.
beautiful book by Rudolsky, an exhibition on,
Mm-hmm. That's
50,
exactly
over
what I was
50
thinking.
years
Yeah.
ago, exactly 50 years ago at MoMA in New York. And Rudolsky in the book, in the catalog, says, well, it's surprising some of the places we still love, we go to visit as tourists, and some other places that were not designed by architects. And then what happened with modern architecture, over the past modern, I would say in a broader sense, uh, in modern times over the past couple of 100 years. And I think one key parameter is people look at different things. They look at the impact of materials, at this kind of collecting knowledge. But one key parameter is about feedback.
Mm,
And again, what changes then I would say based on your question is the ability to get feedback. Feedback means and
uh,
to think about this like an evolving system. We usually try to do something that's very different from everything else, and
mhm.
then we don't want to know at all if things turn out as you want them. So feedback
Right.
is the last thing you want to hear as an artist. So I think I would start by bringing back those two components in the design process.
I love that. Speaking of feedback, I want to actually kind of like shift this to how you actually are thinking about feedback in these dialogues, because it strikes me just in this conversation, you're a practicing architect, you have projects all over the world, you're teaching at MIT, you're running the Sensible City Lab, you curate a biennale like this. How do those different contexts, the academic, the professional practice, the kind of large curatorial space, or the outputs, the paper, the book, the exhibition, the building, how do those change how you think about your research? Are those all asking similar questions and you're just kind of applying those questions to different spaces? Or are those actually changing the questions or changing the ideas in some way?
Yeah, I would say they're doing both, and they're doing both through feedback. As we were saying before, I think the fact of writing, it is great. And sometimes, you are trashed online. Sometimes people love what you say, but it's a way to engage with it. And then you ask yourself questions. Is this, maybe, so you going back to what you're saying, sometimes you also change the question. But I would say, the most beautiful definition of design for me is the one that was given by Herbert Simon.
Mm,
Herbert Simon was a mathematician, perhaps a designer and an economist, won the Nobel Prize. In this beautiful book, The Sciences of the Artificial, he says, the natural sciences look at how the world is, but design looks at how the world ought to be. And
mm,
then, that is what brings together all the efforts you were saying. It's about looking at how we can transform things. And then we can
right.
do it. We can do that by talking about how cities could be different. We can do it through a design project, built or unbuilt. We can do it through research and experimenting. Again, what would be the consequences of different changes in the city? So all of these are kind of almost a way to, again, to accelerate the evolution of the places we live in, hopefully into a better future.
How do those actually how are those in dialogue with your own work? How does the studio's work connect to the lab, or connect to the book, or connect to the Biennale? Do you see those like, is that all one project for you in some way?
You could say it's one project. It's about, it's about the built environment and
Hmm.
trying to see how it could change and using different tools, the tools of research, of data, the tools of design of a new building, the tools of talking about it and study, and all of them, if possible, with this kind of feedback loop that can let it evolve.
I have two more questions to wrap us up. I want to go back to the Biennale for a second because you mentioned earlier that one of the reasons for a Biennale like this is to start a conversation, not to end a conversation. And it's interesting to me that you just are wrapping up the Venice, but you also curated the 2019 Shenzhen Biennale. You curated Manifesta 14. What unique value do big shows like this, international exhibitions, what value do they bring to the conversation that these other forums can't, that you can't do in a book or a building or a class or, a lab at MIT? Beyond scale, beyond sort of space, what do these give you or what do these give to the discourse that is unique to
Yeah.
them?
Yes, I think that's a great question. And the Biennales, when they start, as you said before, at the end of the 19th century, they are more like World's Fair, expos, meeting architecture. It's about looking at the best you find about architectural art all around the world. And
Mm-hmm.
we don't need it anymore. Now that is online, that you find it in real time, even before, you pour concrete, you can see that on social media. And so I think that all of them, I mean, biennales, but also expos, Olympics, design week, and so on, should be more like labs. I wrote about this in for
Mm-hmm.
Bloomberg about the fact I think
Yeah.
the nature of Biennale should change. And the Shenzhen Biennale, for instance, was from the beginning the first one by Jungo Chang. If I'm not wrong, I went to see it with Jungo 20 years ago or so. It was really about that. It was about transforming the city. And there is a big value, I think, in making something concrete, not only talking about the idea, but making it visible. Maybe a temporary idea, so that people can try, can quote, vote with their feet. They go there because they
Right.
like it, or they need it. What we did in Manifesta was do temporary installations in the city. We did the urban study for Pristina in Kosovo, a very interesting city. That became a way again to help that process of feedback. So I think, the physical intervention is still very important in order
Yeah.
to engage people in different ways.
Speaking of this idea of voting with their feet, this actually kind of brings another question to me. So let me throw in an additional question before I get to my last question. How did you think about, especially for Venice, how did you think about the audience or the viewer or the visitor? Who is this show for? Is it for architects? Is it for these other intelligences? Is this for the general public? Is this for the citizens of Venice? How do you think about negotiating those different kind of publics that would encounter the show, or how did you think about the audience for the show?
I think it's for all of us because we said it's about the built environment having to change in the face of changing conditions, climatic and global. And so it's about all of us. And so we try to be able, yes, to have the architecture community to be together. We did a manifesto at the beginning. We're going to do another one at the end. It's about the profession coming together, but also being able to talk beyond the profession. Too often we thought we had the solution. We
Right.
only had to talk to ourselves. I think Venice this year tried to broaden that. And based on the numbers so far, I think we made a little change in that direction.
I think if there's a theme to this conversation, it's conversation, discourse, feedback, dialogue. It's how do these intelligences talk to each other? How do different disciplines talk to each other? How does architect and city or architect and technology, like how are these things all in conversation? So I really love this idea of the Biennale being a lab, being a way to start these conversations, to generate new ideas and put them out into the world. Obviously, it's up for whatever 6 months. You produce a catalog. How do you ensure that these ideas live beyond the Biennale, that these conversations can continue? And then also speaking to what you just said, how do you ensure that they move beyond just architecture? How do you start to think about all the conversation that started around the Biennale? How does that get seeded outside of the architecture discourse? How are you kind of thinking through that as the show wraps up? How to make sure that these ideas stay alive in different ways?
And you're absolutely right. By the way, this is why I was excited to be on your program, because it's about expanding the conversation and continue the conversation. And going back to your question, well, for me, the legacy was very important from the beginning. Somehow, it's a bit ironic to do a Biennale about adaptation to changing climate when the Biennale itself, any Biennale, is a little bit unsustainable. It's about also opening week, you got everybody flying from all over the world to have a spritz in Venice and talk and have a big party, amazing party, very, very warm and exciting. But so what can you? I don't think you can afford it unless you got you can almost have an offset of it through the legacy of ideas. We'll see what happens at the end. But I think the last day on the 23rd, the finissage, really will be about that, about what keeps on living. And there's a lot of people who are bringing this forward in different ways. We'll see it on the 23rd, and then we'll see if that continues. We need to be prepared. I said before, it's like, I think as architects, we are like trying to make changes to the built environment. Sometimes we fail, sometimes we succeed. And so we'll see, maybe we'll fail, but hopefully, some of this will continue, will keep on growing, and together. Again, we might realize that architecture is not about building more. We don't need that. It is about adapting what we have, and again, adapting like we did from the beginning. As we said with Loger in France, 19th century, adapting to a changing climate and a changing planet.
Yeah, I love that. I think that's a great way to wrap this up. Carlo, congratulations on the show. Congratulations on all your work. I'm so glad we got to kind of talk through all of this and how this all connects to the larger project that you've been really engaged in and wrestling with for your entire career. This was a really wonderful conversation. Thanks for being on the show.
Thank you very much for having me. And to be continued.
That was my conversation with Carlo Ratti. Our theme music is by Jeremiah Chu. The show is funded thanks to the generosity of listeners like you. So if you like what we're doing here, I hope you consider supporting us and get some bonus content each month. You can follow us across social media at Surface Podcast. You can listen to all of our previous episodes wherever you get your podcasts and at our website, scratchingthesurface.fm. Thanks for listening.